Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much for being with the National Broadcasting Corporation here in Athens. Let me start this discussion by asking you, how do you assess the state of liberal democracy worldwide? You recently wrote that there is a democratic recession in recent years. Do you sense that it has deepened?
The recession has indeed deepened. I think the election of Donald Trump was a really major setback for liberal democracy around the world. Mm-hmm. I think when the leading liberal democracy elects somebody who basically rejects liberalism, then you're in a lot of trouble. And I think the leadership role that the United States has played in supporting other democratic allies in Europe, in Asia, in resisting, autocratic aggression like the one that Russia launched against Ukraine. If the United States checks out of that kind of role, then liberal democracy is in a great deal of trouble.
We talk a lot about liberal democracy. Where do you find the flaws of liberal democracy? What are the major issues that its supporters did not tackle for the average voter, and we're facing the situation now?
Well, it's complicated because there are multiple reasons. So, there's an economic aspect to this. I think globalization hurt a lot of working class people whose incomes declined, their jobs were outsourced. But that's not the whole explanation, because you actually have a lot of people that are actually doing quite well. For example, all these tech billionaires in Silicon Valley, where I live, a lot of them ended up supporting Donald Trump and believing a lot of his, resentments. Part of it is a cultural thing. I think there's been a lot of cultural change. A lot of things that liberals have supported, like LGBTQ rights, became very controversial. Things moved very quickly in that respect, more quickly than I think a lot of ordinary voters were able to take advantage of. And then part of it, I think, is actually a byproduct of our technology, that we have an online ecosystem that amplifies, extreme voices. And it greatly contributes to polarization because, one side starts looking very extreme, it triggers the other side to match it, and before you know it, the big internet platforms, that's how they make money, is by having people yelling at each other. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that really didn't exist 20 years ago.
Right. But now we're in a phase where identity politics are here to blame for the failure of the Democratic Party. And what's next now? What can this side do to rebuttal?
I think that a couple of scenarios might happen. I think that Trump's economic policies are a disaster. He wants to impose these ridiculously high tariffs on everybody, including our closest allies and friends like Canada. And I think that's going to backfire. It's not going to lead to economic growth. There'll be inflation. There'll be job loss, maybe a recession, that sort of thing. I think on the left, you're going to have a big struggle because, honestly, I think that the only way that the left can come back into power is by moving to the center and proposing policies that are more generally acceptable to the broad mass of citizens. But I think the immediate reaction is going to push the party to the left. And so, you're going to have people insisting that the only reason Donald Trump won was because we didn't offer enough, in terms of going after billionaires and taxing people and so forth. And I don't think that's going to, that's not going to be an agenda that's going to appeal to a lot of people. So we may be in a kind of prolonged struggle at this point.
But I understand you're a pessimist on the economic front. You expect a recession or a couple of years of trouble, I guess.
Yeah, well, if Donald Trump is smart, he's going to actually back down on the tariffs because it's clear that they're not going to make America richer. It's not clear that he's going to do that. We're approaching this moment where he has, he said he's going to have all these deals. He doesn't have any of them. He's got to decide Does he go to the retaliatory tariffs or does he back down? If he backs down, he may actually save himself because, the American economy isn't going to go into a big recession, so forth. If he's serious about them, I think it's going to really hurt him, when we have midterm elections next year.
Mm-hmm. I was a student of political science in the 90s, where your book, The End of History, was the most challenging book in our times. Now, 30 years ago, I would like to ask for your reflections about the book. And was really the premise, the basic assumption that globalization would promote democracy and human rights on the wrong side, or was the implementation that lacked all the necessary tools that could help people around the world?
Well, part of the argument, I think, was wrong. At the core, one of the things I believed when I wrote that book was something vaguely like what's called modernization theory in the social sciences, that as countries become richer, as populations become better educated, that the demand for democratic participation and basic freedom is going to increase. And that definitely did not happen in China. China now has a per capita income that is comparable to South Korea, Taiwan at a slightly earlier stage in their development when they turned into democracies. But China has become a much more authoritarian place despite the fact that it's much richer today. So that social aspect of the theory is not working. I think the other issues are actually ones that I anticipated. So the title of the book was The End of History and the Last Man.
The Last Man, yeah.
The last 5 chapters were devoted to this question of the last man. And, in a way, I think that there I outlined some of the reasons that democracy could actually fall apart because it didn't give people an adequate sense of community. It didn't give people the kind of respect that they felt that they deserved. And I think that it's really an inequality in the distribution of respect rather than the distribution of resources that's really driving a lot of populist movements. There's a huge amount of resentment, so everywhere in the world you have educated people living in big cities that tend to vote for liberal candidates, and the populists have their strength in the countryside and smaller cities, towns, and villages where people are less educated, and it's become this huge social divide over education with a lot of less educated people really resenting the people that do have the opportunities and the training and so forth in big urban areas.
Is this education gap that you're describing that you find the biggest failure of the economic, political, and academic elite around the world?
Well, it's something that was partly the result of what's called neoliberal economic policies. I don't think that extreme form of market-based economics is necessary. And I think the good formula, was some form of social democracy for most of the decades after World War II, where you had, a reasonable amount of social safety net, pensions, health care provided to citizens in general. But beginning in the 1980s and 90s, governments started cutting back on those sorts of things, and that increased inequality, plus which globalization, I think, itself, produced a lot of job loss in rich countries that then fed a lot of the populism that we saw, in the 21st century.
Let's shift the discussion a little bit on the Middle East. First of all, how do you evaluate Donald Trump's decision to bomb Iran?
Well, in the short run, I think it was a success. I think that the Middle East is completely transformed over the last 2 years since October 7th of 2023. Iran at that point looked like it had a huge deterrent against Israel in the form of its missiles and drones, and then they had created these proxy forces, Hezbollah, Hamas, in Syria, they had allies and so forth. Every single one of those now has been destroyed by Israel. And it was a kind of unique opportunity because the Israelis had completely shattered their air defenses, and so for the first time the United States could actually go after this nuclear facility. And they, I would imagine that they've set them back quite a lot. The problem is that, first of all, we don't know the full extent of destruction, and it could be that this is actually, in the long run, simply going to motivate, whatever regime is in Iran to double down on trying to get a weapon. It's certainly going to motivate everybody else in the world to get a nuclear weapon, because people can see that once you have the weapon, you're kind of safe from this kind of attack. But if you don't have the weapon, other powers can do really bad things to you.
Is there now room for diplomacy?
I don't think, I think that in general there needs to be some kind of agreement, for Iran not to restart its nuclear program. Whether that's possible or not, I'm skeptical of, because it's not a sufficiently balanced situation where you can actually get to an agreement.
Back to the United States, do you think the country now is still equipped morally and institutionally to serve as a global advocate for democratic values, especially when its own internal divisions are so pronounced?
No, absolutely not. I mean, we've completely abdicated that role of leadership. I mean, that's what Donald Trump is about. He switched sides. He likes Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin better than any democratically elected leader.
And so who's filling that void?
Europe is trying. I think that I encourage that, because I do think that, Europe is still an important geopolitical player, and it could exert much more influence. I think there's a lot of reasons why it's difficult for Europe to do that. So I do think that other countries, need to step up, but the United States really did play a very, powerful role, and we've basically switched sides, in favor of the authoritarians.
And do you sense that Europe is capable of strategic autonomy? That's the discussion that's running on for the last 5 years, or will it remain dependent on American leadership?
Well, both. I mean, it's never going to replace the United States in terms of the ability to act strategically, but it can certainly increase its degree of autonomy. And it comes down to whether you can support Ukraine adequately right now. And I think Europe, is capable of doing that. Whether it could actually play a really major role the way the United States did, that's more questionable.
Finally, Professor Fukuyama, what is this fight between the Trump administration and the Ivy League schools about?
This is a cultural fight that's a matter of pure resentment. That you have an elite that goes to these schools, that, occupies leadership positions, not simply in government, but also in culture, in the media, Hollywood. It's a very powerful cultural force, and I think there's a lot of resentment by populists of that. And so the Trump administration has gone on this campaign to try to undermine these elite schools, and it's utterly stupid. I mean, you're stopping funding for basic scientific research in medicine and physics and many other fields just to punish Harvard because you resent it. It's crazy. It's again a very self-destructive policy. But I think that in general, this administration has done more to weaken the United States as a global power, both in the short run by the diplomatic choices it's made, but in the long run by undermining the sources of its own strength.
To that sense, do you sense that America's soft power is in decline?
Well, it's been, deliberately undermined. That's what happens if you shut down our aid agency or the National Endowment for Democracy or, all of the broadcasters that, had supported democratic regimes and values around the world. They've lost their funding. The administration doesn't want to operate them anymore. So American soft power is very, very much diminished.
And in terms of the everyday life, how much it is affected? How much your, academic life affected by this fight? Say, for example, at Stanford, do you discuss this?
Well, Stanford has not been directly targeted the way Harvard has, but we've been told next year we have a 10% budget cut because the Republicans want to tax university endowments. They've cut off the funding for a lot of research grants, and so the university is going to suffer directly from
And
this.
do you sense that the academics and scientists...
By the way, I want to say the biggest blow to Stanford or any other school is this hostility against non-Americans. And so we've had to, I run a program in international policy. Your prime minister was actually a graduate of my program many years ago. And the administration wants to keep people like him from attending Stanford University. It's completely crazy. We've had to tell our foreign students, don't go home for vacation because they may not let you come back into the country. What kind of country does stuff like this? So yes, it's definitely affected us.
And do you sense that scientists and academics might fly away from the U.S. and choose other destinations to do their work?
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately one of the consequences. If you look at American science, it's unbelievably international. If you look at articles published in Science or Nature, any of the leading journals, and you look at the names, of the people writing these articles, 2/3 of them are either non-Americans or they were Americans that were born outside of the United States. And so I think that international diversity has been incredibly important to the success of basic scientific research and then to technology.
Final question. You've been following our country closely. You've been visiting for the last 5 years. What is your take about our country, how it picked up from a 10-year crisis, and what's your aspirations for, the years ahead?
Well, I think it's very admirable what's happened in Greece. I think it's had pretty good government over that period. I think that given the social stresses during the Euro crisis, it wouldn't have been surprising if you'd gotten a populist, kind of extremist government running the country, and you managed to avoid that. And I think that's one of the reasons that Greece has done as well as it has.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much for being with her tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.